As I was thinking about Reign of Christ Sunday, as I was thinking about Advent, which is a season in the life of the church that begins next Sunday, I was reminded of the few times that I've played organized football in my life. I played three different times I've played organized football, two different kinds. One was tackle, and the other one was flag football. But two of those three times I've participated in some kind of organized league, I've broken bones, which is not very good luck for me. As you can see, I'm not really built for football anyway. The first time I broke bones was in 7th grade at Garner Middle School. I was a proud yearling. I still am a proud yearling. I was on the 7th grade blue team, and I was a quarterback. Don't mean to brag. I think I was one of the few kids who could remember plays. That's why they put me at quarterback. I didn't start. I wasn't that good. But I was on the kickoff team. No, it was kickoff return team. I was on the kickoff return team. And I actually broke my arm one kickoff return, except they didn't know I broke my arm. So for 3 weeks, doctors tried to treat it like it was anything but a broken arm. And in fact, I went to physical therapy for a few different sessions because they thought something was wrong with my muscle. And so they did something called ultrasound therapy, where they wrapped this strap around my arm and they sent in ultrasound waves into my arm to try and make the muscle twitch and spasm and react. Except all it was doing was sending these waves right into my broken bone. And it was not very pleasant. I remember my mom, who was a neonatal nurse practitioner, tried to teach me Lamaze breathing techniques. And I told her it's not working. And she said, yeah, that's what the moms say too. So that was the first time I broke a bone. The second time was much later in my life. I was well past my prime age of playing football. I was in graduate school at Duke, and I was playing flag football with some friends of mine, and I broke some fingers on my right hand and dislocated one of them when I was trying to grab somebody's flag, and they turned into me. And so I went to Duke Health, Duke Medicine, which is among the premier medical institutions in the United States. And little did I know I would be treated by a man named Dr. Jeff Bytomsky. That name doesn't need to mean anything to you unless you are an avid Duke basketball fan like myself. You will see him sitting behind the bench of Duke's basketball team because he's the head physician for Duke's basketball team. But he was the one who treated my broken fingers. And he set them in place. He gave me these nice little casts on my fingers, which my wife told me looked like witch fingers. And he took care of me and actually got me an exemption for my midterms that year where I didn't have to write because I'm right-handed. So I got to type instead. And I felt like that was an unfair advantage. But that's what I get, I guess, for breaking my fingers in graduate school playing flag football, is you get ahead in life. That's what I learned. But what I was thinking was the first injury, there was a wrong diagnosis and therefore a wrong treatment protocol. The second injury, I was in good hands. They diagnosed the injury correctly immediately and provided the right treatment. Now, why am I talking about flag football and broken bones? Because when I think about Daniel 7 and the image, the vision that the prophet Daniel passes on to us today, I think about the word judgment. And you heard that in chapter 7. You heard that the court sat in judgment in verse 10. Now, when you hear that word judgment, I wonder if the connotations and images that come to your mind are all negative ones. I wonder if it raises in you some kind of anxiety or fear, or maybe you're over it. Maybe you just check out and zone out when you hear that word judgment. And believe it or not, in Daniel's world at his time, when he passed this vision along to his first listeners, this would have been good news. Judgment was meant as an assurance and a promise. So why, thousands of years later, when we come before these words and we hear that particular word, judgment, why does it create negative feelings? Why does that feeling of fear and dread rise up in us? When it was meant to be good news, why does it sound like grim news instead? Well, you have the church to blame for that. I regret to inform you, my brothers and sisters, that for many, many years, the church has wielded judgment as a weapon, as a tool to strike fear into your hearts, to keep you in line. It's been used to keep you inside the square of what's considered acceptable, whatever day and age is in the life of the church. So whatever that looked like 1,000 years ago, it's different today, but the point remains. When we talk about judgment in the church, usually we're using it in a threatening tone. We say, if you step out, if you misbehave, if you don't do this, or if you do that, God will bring judgment against you. Does that sound familiar? What that creates in us, first off, I was reminded by a mentor of mine, a pastor who I worked for previously, Ben Trammell, who reminded me that shame and fear are really powerful tools that create short-term results, but in the long term create a lot of problems. Shame and fear are effective at getting to control people in the short term, but long term, they create problems that we're not ready to solve, that we shouldn't even be messing with in the first place. And how we've used judgment is to create shame and fear in the lives of those who are doing their best to try and follow Jesus the Christ. So, judgment, what is that all about? Why is it assigned to us on this Reign of Christ Sunday, this very last Sunday in the Christian year before we turn the page and look to another year? What is that all about? Well, first, I better mention a couple of things. When Daniel's audience heard these words way back when, people think, by the way, that this was written 150 years before, or 200 years before Jesus showed up on the scene. And in Daniel's day and age, the people of Israel were constantly being ruled by outsiders, by empires who would come into Judea and sweep across the land and instill a new order. And so people hypothesize that by the time of Daniel's visions and writing, there's an empire called the Seleucids who are now ruling in Israel. The Seleucids were kind of like the inheritors or the descendants of Alexander the Great's Greek empire. The Seleucids are the ones who took over after Alexander died. And when Daniel is writing, people hypothesize that there's a particular Seleucid king on the throne, and his name is Antiochus IV. Now, Antiochus IV had a nickname. It was Epiphanes. And what Epiphanes translates to from Greek is God manifest. Antiochus Epiphanes, God made flesh. Except that this God who showed up for the people of Israel was anything but good news. Antiochus IV is recorded not only in the Bible, but by outside biblical sources as a terrible ruler. He came in and he outlawed all Jewish cultural and religious practices. And instead, he sought to make everybody, Israel and beyond, like the Greeks. He tried to Hellenize his empire. And one of the things he did is went into the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Jerusalem, and he sacrificed pigs, which are, of course, not kosher. He did all kinds of things to try and stamp out the Jewish religion, which ultimately leads to a rebellion from the Jews, which you might know as the Maccabean Revolt. But when Daniel's writing, he's writing these words, these visions, to a people who are suffering under the foot of an empire. You see, when empire reigns, it's good news for some, but usually bad news for the rest of us. And here, I love right before the verses we got to this morning in Daniel 7, there's this little allusion that people think Daniel's making reference to Antiochus. Here's what it says in verse 8 of chapter 7. I was considering the horns. He's having a vision of a beast with these horns in its head. He says, I was considering the horns when another horn appeared, a little one coming up among them. To make room for it, 3 of the earlier horns were plucked up by the roots. There were eyes like human eyes in this horn, and a mouth speaking arrogantly. A little horn speaking words of arrogance. Daniel's making coded reference to this tyrannical ruler who seeks to obliterate the way of God's people. And so what vision does Daniel have to give people a word of hope and encouragement in such a dark, dismal time? Well, then we get these words, verses 9 and 10. As I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued from his presence and flowed outward. You think this king is powerful? Look at the God you worship. Look at the God who rules and makes everything new. This God is much bigger, much more impressive than the little horn who speaks arrogantly. You see, judgment is good news for the people thousands of years ago, because the way things are right now in their day and age, they won't always be this way. Things will be made right. Now, when we talk about judgment, it doesn't sound like that. Judgment sounds like this. Oh, you did this wrong thing. Now you've got to worry that God's going to hold it against you. You've got this record, this rap sheet, and God really wants to declare you guilty. Oh, but you got lucky. Jesus got in the way at the last second and took the fall for you instead. Now, I know I'm kind of making fun of it, but this is the way we often talk about the work that God does in our lives. Like it's a courtroom where God is judge, jury, and executioner, but instead Jesus takes the fall. But what if we talked about the way that God relates to us in different terms? What if we thought about it not as a courtroom scene, but as a hospital scene? What if we thought about the problems we face not as marks on our permanent record, but wounds and diseases and broken bones that we go to God to get treated? John Wesley, who's the founder of the Methodist movement, he's kind of our forerunner in the United Methodist Church. John Wesley loved to talk about God's grace through a therapeutic lens. That is, God's grace heals us and makes us stronger. Like a broken bone that's been set and cast and healed so that the new bone that fills in is strong. That's what he said God's grace does to us. We come to God and in need of medicinal help. We're sick to the point of death. And God gives us the medicine we need to be brought back, to be revived and invigorated. You see, when we think about judgment in these terms, it becomes a little less threatening. And I know that judgment may not be the most helpful word for you because of all the baggage it carries. So maybe you could use justice. You could use rectification if you want to sound really fancy like a theologian. Whatever it is, the promise is that God's not going to put you into prison or in timeout at the very end. The promise is that God sees how bad things are in this world and won't let it last forever. That God is ultimately working even here and now to make it better, to heal us, to put back together what has been broken. Now, I talked about the broken bones and the issues that I've had with doctors and then the good experiences I've had with doctors because I want to point out that there are all these moments where we entrust ourselves to the help of doctors, right? We don't know them from anybody else, but when we're hurting and sick, we're not afraid to go and put our lives into their hands. Well, how much more can we trust the one who made us, who knows us, who loves us more intimately than we can even love ourselves? How much more can we trust that great physician, as John Wesley talked about? There was a church father almost at the time of Jesus. He's just a couple of hundred years later. His name was Origen of Alexandria. And Origen wrote this book called On First Principles, which is kind of like one of the first books ever written by a Christian leader that took on. It took hold throughout the ancient world. And in that book, Origen addressed this question. He said that if God is considered a consuming fire, did you hear the fire language in Daniel 7? That probably didn't make you feel too good, did it? But Origen says, now if God is called a consuming fire throughout Scripture, what does God consume? What kinds of things does that fire burn up? Now, a lot of us want to jump to the conclusion that God's going to burn up some of us and maybe not others. Or maybe God's going to burn the whole thing down and start new with the people he really likes. But this is what Origen says. Origen says, God indeed does consume and destroy, but what God consumes is evil. Our evil thoughts, our wicked actions, our desires for all sin, and all that destroys that is what is made by God. The substance of all that God has made certainly abides. Now that, friends, that was like 1,700 years ago. And we've lost the plot in some ways, but that's how the church originally thought about judgment. It wasn't about destruction and separation from God. The ultimate goal of judgment was to get union with God, to be brought back into right, perfect relationship, not only with our Creator, but with the rest of creation. The goal is union, so that all that keeps us apart from God is what gets removed and separated. And that is good news. Because think about it. How many times in your life have you collected garbage that gets dragged along with you in your life, right? Maybe it's past mistakes that you can't let go of. Maybe it's relationships that have been broken that still hurt you. Maybe it's things you didn't get to do that you wished you could have done, but you can't change the past. Whatever it is, the promise is that God will make all of that right. And if there's stuff that continues to hurt you and consume you, that is what God will consume. So Origen looks at all of these images of God as fire. And it's not only in Daniel with the stream of fire that goes out from God's presence. It's the prophet Malachi who talks about God as a refiner's fire. It's the prophet Zephaniah who says that God will consume the earth with this molten fire. It's the apostle Paul in the letter to the Corinthian church who says that our work in our lives will be tested by fire. But fire is not about destroying us. It's about purifying us, making us who God has always intended us to be, so that the stuff that gets removed is the stuff that ultimately wasn't good for us in the first place. That's what the image of fire is about. And so judgment is this promise that all the stuff we've collected in our lives, all the bad stuff, or maybe the things we've been wanting and lacking, that's the stuff that God will address and mend at the very end. Next week, we're starting this season of Advent. And Advent is 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas Eve. And a lot of times we kind of treat Advent as a time to get ready for Christmas. We put up our trees, we go buy our gifts, we go to the holiday parties, we sing some Christmas carols, all in preparation for December 25th. But originally in the Christian calendar, Advent wasn't about preparing for Christmas. Advent was about looking ahead to the return of Christ. The Episcopalian priest Fleming Rutledge, who is a hero of mine, Fleming Rutledge talks about the Christian year. And she says, you know, a lot of the Christian year is structured around looking at Jesus's historical life. So the things you know, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, Epiphany, all of these are seasons in the life of our church where we look at these important moments in the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Advent, Fleming Rutledge says, is different. It's different in that it doesn't look backwards, but it looks beyond history altogether. And it looks toward the season of last things. Seasons like the time of judgment. And again, that can strike us with fear, but the promise, Rutledge says, is that Advent is about looking ahead and having the hope that God will make good on God's promises. That God will not leave us where we are, but will make us what we long to be. Creatures who are in perfect relationship with God, with each other, with the world, and with ourselves. That's the promise of Advent. Friends, you don't have to use the word judgment when you go out from this place, but I encourage you during this season of Advent to be a people who embrace that promise, to share and assure others in our world that the bad thing is never the last thing, but that God does make good on this promise and will make good. Because Christ has come and Christ will return in victory. That we believe that reign of Christ is one of love and perfection and redemption. So God doesn't operate in this world where the last word is, are you innocent or guilty? God operates in a world where the last word is you being set right and mended and healed by that medicine that is grace.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.